Hello, my fellow theatre people. Today I come to you with Measure for Measure by William Shakespeare, a part of Shaketube 2019, where our lovely hosts, Steve Donoghue, Lukas at Totally Pretentious, and Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse host us in a reading of Shakespeare plays throughout the weeks of September. This week Measure for Measure is one of those plays. Next week, it's just going to be The Two Gentlemen of Verona. So let's get into Measure for Measure. I'm trying to think of Mr. Take, oh, take those lips away, that so sweetly were forsworn, and those eyes the break of day, lights that do mislead the morn, but my kisses bring again, seals of love, but sealed in vain, sealed in vain. I don't know why I think Mr. But yes, Measure for Measure, set in Vienna. The Duke leaves Angelo in charge of Vienna, where this very puritanical guy, immediately decides to enforce all the rules that had been left lax under the Duke, and condemns Claudio to death for getting Juliet, kind of a serving girl, kind of cousin, getting her pregnant. Isabella, his sister, pleads for his life to Angelo, and in the end, Angelo says, "Yeah, I'll do it if you sleep with me." One of these monstrous bargains. We'll get back to that later. The Duke, as a friar, gets Isabella to agree to this monstrous deal, but switches her out in a bed trick, yet another kind of little set piece, with Mariana, a woman that Angelo has kind of discarded in the past because her brother got lost at sea and the dowry went away, and he was like, nope, I walked away from that, thus condemning her to being not a wife, not a maiden, just being basically nothing in this society. Now, Angelo had no intention of actually sparing Claudio, and had already set in motion basically whatever I say later. Angelo gets beheaded. I want to see his head on a spike, and stuff like that. The Duke prevents this, and substitutes the head, but doesn't actually let Isabella know that he's done this for his own kind of motivations, which we will get to. So the Duke returns and he says, "Oh, everyone come out, and like, you've got grievances, come out." And indeed, Isabella comes out and cries for justice. This guy, he killed my brother. He slept with me under the deal that he wouldn't. Angelo, who's already said, "Well, if you try and accuse me, no one's going to believe you because I have a spotless record. And everyone's just going to think that you're basically you're the bitter one." And says, like, "Oh, it's this friar's put you up to it." Indeed, everybody around the court doesn't, it's kind of classic. Oh, it's like, well, it's Angelo, he's the dude, he's the kind of the guy in charge, he has a spotless reputation, and all the dudes kind of line up behind him to one degree or another. But Lucio in particular, kind of this kind of low life. He was kind of a friend of Claudio, but he immediately kind of gangs up and says, like, "Oh, the friar, he was bad mouthing you, Duke. He was bad mouthing you." And the Duke, who was the friar, it's like, "Oh, well, I'll go away and we'll bring out this friar." And he brings him out, and they go at him. They're going to torture him to death. They're going to get the truth because they know they're not going to get the truth. And the Duke gets, he lets all this play out to basically reveal exactly how corrupt and lying and these people are. He's revealed, at which point Angelo immediately goes, "Oh God, I am guiltier than guiltio. Oh, my dread lord, I should be guiltier than my guiltiness. To think I can be undiscernible when I perceived your grace, like power divine, hath looked upon my passes. Then, good prince, no longer session hold upon my shame, but let my trial be mine own confession. Immediate sentence then, and subsequent and sequence death. It's all the grace I beg." So he is perhaps super penitent. You could also say he's like going for the Duke was lax before, so maybe he's gonna. I'm putting editorializing. He basically asked for death. The woman that he discarded, Mariana, says, like, well, no, I want him, I still want him. And the Duke says, okay, well, you can marry him, but then they marry, but then it's like, okay, I'm still sentencing you to death. It's like she pleads for him, saying like, the best men are molded out of faults, and for the most become much more the better. For being a little bad, so may my husband. And indeed, she calls on Isabella to defend her. Isabella, who at this point still thinks that Claudio has been killed by this guy, has been executed by this guy. And, he was going to, like, he wanted to sleep with her to actually and he actually thought he did sleep with her and still killed Angelo. And what she says is, I partly think a due sincerity. She kneels beside Marianne, and says, I partly think a due sincerity governed his deeds, till he looked on me. So till his lust kind of took over and he became very base. In some ways, he followed very much the letter of the law in condemning Angelo, and if he'd executed him just straight that way without all the sleeping stuff, he would be within the letter of the law, the thing, even if he was completely outside of the sincerity of it. And the Duke does pardon him. He just marries Mariana, and then he reveals that Claudio didn't get executed, and proposes to Isabella, and Isabella has no reply in the play. She has no response. That can be left up to the theater directors how they want to play that. So that is the play. I had a very strong reaction, probably what is a very strong contemporary reaction to this play. Very much the kind of like, hey honey, you can accuse me, but I have a spotless record. No one's going to believe you. It's just going to all go back on you, and we're going to attack you. And indeed, before the Duke reveals himself, it's like, we're going to torture all of you. We're going to torture the women. Which is like, you think about this is like, yes, nowadays it's like, Harvey Weinstein unleashing the PR campaign and all these kind of secret agents to basically kind of pump women for damning information, to destroy them, to torture them in the public opinion, kill them publicly, if not actual physical public. So you get that kind of real strong sentence for it. And indeed, Angelo's reaction after he's exposed, he goes from like, we're just gonna kill you and we're gonna torture you and all that, to, oh, I'm very guilty. Oh my God, yeah, just kill me. I'm terribly guilty. I'm basically throwing myself on mercy. Sounds very familiar to thing. Also have a very strong reaction to the whole thing of, it's like, oh, the Duke's like, well, your punishment is, and he also punishes Lucio the same way of like, oh, I'm going to marry you off to a woman. I'm going to marry you off to Marianne, who's actually a better woman than you, and that will make her kind of the superior. And Lucio, he marries off to a punk, which is basically a prostitute, which is apparently it's a punishment. It's a punishment putting, marrying a man off to a prostitute, when he slanders his lord. It's equivalent thing. I think Lucio says, oh, it's better, be hung, drawn, and quartered than to be married to a punk. And I mean, in some ways, he really means that destroys his name. So as a contemporary reading that now, you're thinking like, oh, that is super gross. And indeed, there's even the thing of Claudio in the play. Claudio has had sex with Juliet consensually, and that, and they want to get married. There seems to be some problem with a kind of a dowry and stuff like that, but they want to get married. And Angelo is seized upon this case as, for some reason, this is the one I'm going to make an example of. Now, in a lot of the sources for this play, kind of the Italian sources, and just sort of general things of like, oh, your brother has slept with a woman and I'm going to make you have to sleep with me for it. A lot of cases, the brother has raped the woman. Now, there's a tricky thing here, because rape in a medieval setting, medieval or early setting like that, can also mean not the woman's consent, but the family's consent. If the father, primarily the father, does not give consent, well, then you're taking his property without his permission. So therefore it is a rape. Now there seems to be a thing where the Christians kind of Christianity comes in, and it becomes it is personal injury, but there's also a thing of a woman, if a woman doesn't resist getting like abducted by her lover or stuff like that, she could also be considered guilty of the rape. If she doesn't cry rape at the time, then she too can get punished. So which is like a great thing. But indeed, a common practice even in early medieval times, and even in this play, it's like, well, the punishment for a rapist was marrying the woman that they raped, because you're not, it's not reparations to the woman, it's reparations to the family for having taken their property. So at the end of the play, when the Duke sentences Angelo to marry the woman that he discarded, that is actually considered kind of like a legalistic punishment in the thing. So yeah, that really stirred me up. It's like, oh my God, this is like a black, dark, gross comedy. It's like, and it's not happy ending at the end. There's the whole thing, especially I haven't even gotten to like the whole thing of Isabella is at the she starts off the play, I didn't say in the introduction, as a novice, as a she hasn't taken the vows to become a nun yet, but that's what she's coming into. It's apparently a highly kind of restrictive order of nuns, and indeed at the beginning of the play she's going, I was hoping it was going to be stricter, which is like, okay, it's interesting how you have Angelo, who is very much he's characterized as being very bloodless, of being precise, which is apparently code word for kind of Puritan, of him being kind of an extremist of the laws, and like we should just not consider feelings at all, and it should just be you do those laws and you don't make any kind of extenuating circumstances. You don't consider any feelings. You don't consider like, oh, the couple loved each other and they were trying. It's like, no, he broke the law, thus he must die. You have Isabella on the other side being like, I want to be put into such a kind of a state of control in this monastery where you're going to be restricted from men. I think it's they refer to as like, well, you can talk to a man, but the man can't see you, or you can see a man, but you can't talk. You can't have intercourse that way because you've been married to Christ, and so thus that is the only kind of patriarchal relationship you are going to have once you've entered this order. And so Isabella is sort of an extremist, as well as Angelo are an extremist. And when they come together in this scholastic kind of debate over, about Claudio, Isabella has to kind of make arguments to kind of for leniency, for kind of excuse of his is what is considered wrong behavior. It's premarital sex. Interestingly enough, a lot of the conjecture is that Shakespeare got married and then he had his first child very, very soon after that, in a way that implies, yes, premarital sex. But so you got Isabella, who gets tricked by the Duke all the way through this, gets manipulated by him, gets told her brother is dead. He all seems to be like, if you view the Duke as a guy, he seems to be testing her throughout the play. It's like, oh, how good are you? How good are you? And at the end, she's like, she gives up. She gives up everything. She gives up her brother, saying like, well, he killed my brother, but I still think, we should have mercy on him. Have mercy on him. I think he was sincere, except when he looked at me, which almost like, it's like I'm taking I'm somehow, I think, oh, I lure, I am the tempter. There is a thing in there of the tempter stuff, which is gross. And at the end, the Duke's like, oh, great. Well, that's wonderful. And he tries a couple of times in there. I think she's too busy kind of welcoming her brother that, hey, why don't you you and I let us get married. And Isabella makes no reply. When we get into the Marjorie, Garber, Emma Smith, and Tina Packer, they often talk about like how these plays are. I'll describe what those writers talked about these plays. But when they talk about the how this play is being put on, there's all these efforts to sort of jolly it up in a way, where at the end it's like Isabella goes, throws her arms around the Duke, and it's a big happy ending and everyone's smiling and, oh, it's so great, versus Angelo's been punished by being married to this woman. Lucio's been punished by being married to a prostitute. That Isabella has not been asked if she wants to get married. And indeed, there are some parts, some productions of the play where Isabella at the end looks on to disgust and just kind of storms off the stage. It's like you can see this as a much as at the end it's very dark. That said, maybe I should get into. I went with kind of my three go-tos at this point. Marjorie Garber. I'll link to her lecture down below. She's also written a book on Shakespeare. Her lecture on Measure for Measure, which was a really good one. Emma Smith from This is Shakespeare, which of course I don't have on me, but I held it up enough times. This is Shakespeare, and her podcast, Approaching Shakespeare, which the podcast. I'll put the episode of Measure for Measure. It's very much like the book. It's definitely her dry run to have the chapter on the book. And Tina Packer, Women of Will, and her read through of Measure for Measure. Which spoiler, I don't actually hate when she sticks into the plays. I don't have too many issues with Tina Packer on her interpretations of the play itself versus imagining Shakespeare's life, which I find not as valuable. But there seems to be amongst more Marjorie Garber and Emma Smith, there's the various, they pick through the various readings of this play. Probably starting off with just sort of like authorship of the play. This was first published in 1623 in the first folio. That's basically when they did the big collected works. And this was put in the comedies, straight in the comedies, tragedies, histories. That was all there was. Problem plays, romances, that came later as further layering on of scholarship. But this posthumous publication in 1623, Shakespeare died in 1616, is the first time that the play was published. And there does seem to be some scholarship that suggests that because this is the first time it was published, it had probably gotten worked up a couple of times or rewritten or have a little bit of overlay on top of what might have been the original Shakespearean text. The textual analysis at this point says, hey, Middleton, Thomas Middleton has probably had some hand in this version of the play. This isn't me doing conspiracy theories on, Shakespeare didn't write the plays. This is just yes, there was a Shakespeare, and just the working process of people of the company using this play. They'd say, oh yeah, this is great, but we need a little bit of a rewrite here. Shakespeare's not around. Here Middleton comes in, does rewrites, kind of punches it up a little bit. He's more the hot guy at that point, working guy at that point, whereas Shakespeare probably is retired, has walked off the scene before, I think it's 1611, he's walked off the scene, so that when you finally come to publish it, what they're using is the company's version, which is not maybe a pure Shakespeare, but we get what we get, so we accept, and you go from there. So there's that. So there's various interpretations of the play. It's interesting. There's stuff where I'm very much reacting to the Duke as this kind of creepy guy who's controlling stuff. He starts all of this off to he talks about he's basically why is he doing this? Why is he wandering off to and put Angelo in charge? And he says why is he doing the screen? And he just I don't have time right now. I'll tell you later. Never does. But only this one. Lord Angelo is precise. That precise Puritan word. Lord Angelo is precise, stands at guard with envy, scarce confess that his blood flows, or that his appetite is more to bread than stone. Hence shall we see if power change purpose, what our seemers be. So, and that seeming, there's always that seem in this play of disguise. The Duke being the big disguiser, but also Angelo. Is he really a Puritan? When he gets power, will the power immediately corrupt him? Will he use his power to abuse somebody who's come to him for mercy for their brother, which he does. So the Duke's like, oh, I'm not sure about this guy. I'm going to test him. So he tests Angelo. He tests Isabella, and the interpretation that both Garber and Smith talk about is the Duke as director, not so much, I guess, as playwright, but as somebody who's moving around the parts and kind of seeing how it goes. Although you can still see like an author kind of like testing characters and like, oh, how hard can I push you? What will you do if I do that to you? There's also an historical reading of this play because this is commonly accepted because dates in Shakespeare. Don't tell Tina Packer, but we don't really know. But that this seems to be a Jacobean play. That means a play written in the reign of King James. And that's the idea of as the Duke as King James, as a guy who didn't like to put himself in front of the public, who liked to kind of hold off and kind of observe. And there's also kind of the idea of kind of Elizabeth had spy state, but just that kind of idea of like, we're going to spy and we're going to observe our citizens and stuff like that. There's also the ideas of genre in this play, reading it as genre, like, because it is structured like a comedy. The last act is it's funny because up until the last act, I was kind of going like, okay, yeah, we're kind of going along, but it's kind of seems drama free because the Duke is kind of manipulating everything. But at that very last big act, there's a lot of action. He's still manipulating, but he's doing it kind of frantically, and there's a part of that franticness is we're going to wrestle this back into a comedy form, a structure. It's maybe not like it feels like a happy ending, but it's structured like a happy ending. We're going to have a whole bunch of marriages at the end, two couple of forced marriages, and then a proposal that doesn't actually get accepted one way or the other, or you'll have to leave it up to the director to decide whether they're going to have Isabella go, oh, my big handsome man, I'm going to give you a big, oh boy, I wouldn't make a good Shakespearean actor back in the day. My female voice is pretty horrible, but that will it be that kind of happy ending, or will they will she storm off? It seems like earlier directors were very much of that. Oh, we're gonna force it in to be a happy ending. There's actually an interesting, I think it's Emma Smith really makes a note that this play, because it is dark, has actually infected other plays, that people started look at the other plays and seen them not as all just so trippingly, aha, la la la, Heidi ho, it's a happy play. It's like, but actually know that there's some complex, thorny issues here, and there's darkness here, which, that's me. I like my darkness. I am wearing my black t-shirt. I must be a super goth kind of guy. So there's that idea of, we shift, and it's interesting because I think it's Emma Smith especially talks about how women in comedies actually seem to get more agency, get more dialogue, where in tragedies women kind of go silent. And there's a sense where that in the start of this play, Isabella gets the majority of her dialogue, of her talking, but by the end of the play, she's silenced. She by the very, very, very end, she has no reply. She has been, in comedic terms, defeated by the Duke, and will have to accept her fate as she's been conquered by him. Is one interpretation, which would, I guess, go with yeah, I guess I'm going to have to marry you. You've proved your power. You've proved my power over me. And I think, I think I've talked about kind of the feminist interpretation of this, though it was interesting in Garber's lecture, she's quite sharp on the idea of, oh, you don't like the Duke, he's a creep. And that we have a very contemporary reaction to him, but that, going back to kind of like the concepts of kind of stuff like rape and just like, what was a female's position in this world. It's not, at the contemporary at the time might have taken forced marriage at the end as a happy, just ending to this play. It may have played more as a comedy at that point than it does now with our contemporary feelings to it. And it's interesting to kind of explore that it can be both ways, though it's interesting because Shakespeare is so good at leaving these gaps. I mean, I think I talked about Emma Smith talking about how gappy Shakespeare is, and this is just like Isabella saying nothing at the end is just that wonderful gap, which, blossoms into however many interpretations of the play as possible. It's interesting. Tina Packer, who I've talked about in this channel more before, with her Women of Will, which is following the feminine in Shakespeare's plays, and I've had trouble because of, her imagined history of Shakespeare, and sometimes blurring that so much that it bothers me as someone who doesn't have enough of a handle on Shakespeare to immediately go, okay, imagine, oh, little true, imagine. But when she's talking about the play itself, she actually is kind of lines up with Garber on some points, like kind of the idea of like Isabella when she's arguing, when she's debating with Angelo, gets her imagery, like, she's like, I would rather give up my body, then, I would rather, be whipped and wear the blood like rubies, stripped naked in a bed, which is like, okay, we're getting into very sexual imagery here in the middle of your saying to this guy, no, I'm not going to sleep with you. There's like a lot of like kind of that repressed energy in her. And even later when she goes to Claudio expecting him to say, yeah, I'd prefer to die. And Claudio actually has a very kind of more modern kind of reaction to death after the Duke as a friar tries to get like, oh, I'm going to go on to a better world and stuff like that. But he kind of goes like, I don't know what's going to come next. What's going to be beyond. And it could be a horrible, or it could be like, nothing. I could just, a clot of dirt. There's a very kind of a modern kind of thing of like, actually, I kind of choose life. And she freaks out and accuses him of sort of incest in saying like, you're going to take life from me having sex with this guy. You're going to be basically participating in the act of having sex with me, which is like, that's kind of an interesting place to go. Is Isabella in this play. And she's this in the end Tina Packer's like, how would she deal with the ending of the play? I would have expected with Tina Packer, because she's definitely kind of going from a very kind of a certain kind of a feminist line on how she's reading these plays of Shakespeare, kind of slowly maturing and recognizing women as actual people. She actually ends up saying like, well, I'd actually in the end turn the Duke into sort of a divine higher power, and have that and stage the last scene is almost like the Sistine Chapel, with the Duke being God and Isabella being Adam, and that kind of that touch, that touch of giving life at the end, which is like, that's an interest, which she sees as a kind of a unification of the sexual and the spiritual, which she's very much into in this book, to the point where my eyes cross, trying to kind of digest it all. But which is interesting, because one of the other interpretations of the play, which I hadn't brought up before, but it's in the title, Measure for Measure, is the Christian parable allegory of measure for measure, which is an allusion to Matthew 7:2, which is, for in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. So there's very much the idea of the Duke as a divine. One interpretation, one kind of Christian interpretation is the Duke as a disguised God coming amongst the people in a humble thing, making himself open to, at the very end of the play, kind of threats of, we're going to torture you, we're going to put you through the ringer. And he's like, you almost see that as almost as Christ-like, as kind of embodied humanity, in that, who can be wronged and reviled. And then in the end, there's a revelation. There's the great unmasking, where he reveals himself, and Angelo is judged and punished, and so are various other characters in the play. And it's interesting because you have Isabella at the beginning, who's preparing to marry somebody. She's preparing to marry. Nuns marry Christ, or they they marry Christ, right? They're brides of Christ. Yes, brides of Christ. Thus, this is how seriously you should take my Christian allegory, if I can't even have that at the tip of my tongue. Bride of Christ, by the end, she's the bride of the Duke, and whether maybe they're analogous things where she's come full circle, and thus that is a kind of, in some ways I tip my hat to Tina Packer. I don't know how much of that is she's influenced by her own history and own investigation of the play, of that kind of that idea of Isabella marrying the Duke, which takes me from a long way away from the Duke is a creepy asshole guy, as bad as Angelo, who he tortures this poor woman by not telling her that her husband is there, because he basically wants to test her to this thing of he's a divine power, and he's going to, it's going to be a spiritual and sexual unification at the end, that Shakespeare is achieving. So that said, it was an interesting play. As always, I'm super happy for doing this. This was I'll put a link down below to Lukas's video, because he is the one who selected this play for this week. There's also going to be videos by Jason about Winter's Tale, and I guess grudgingly Steve Donoghue will be doing Henry VIII, but you can go to his channel to hear all about that. Yeah, that's all I have to say. Wow, yeah, 30 minutes. So I guess that should be all I have to say for right now. More videos later.